Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone is having a really good day. Happy Wednesday. Now, at this time, I need you guys to go ahead and get your journals and a writing utensil out so you can take notes for the day because I will be checking these. Unfortunately, I could not be here in class with you today because I do have another class to teach, but I have created this lovely video for you all to watch and take notes on. And of course, if you have any questions about the information on this lesson, make sure you ask me. This is your friendly reminder that I will be hosting retakes for the Period 3 exam this Thursday and Friday after school. So if you are one of the people who didn't like your grade, make sure you come by and retake your test. This is also another friendly reminder that next Tuesday on the 12th, you guys will be having your Period 4 exam. Last class, I handed out your study guide for that, but if you need a new one or you would like some additional tutoring for that, go ahead and let me know, and I will be happy to provide those for you. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with the lesson for today. Based off of your readings, it was talking about slavery, right? And so that is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about slavery and plantation life, specifically after the market revolution happened. So as we talked about before our Socratic seminar, we were talking about the market revolution and how that really affected the North, especially the northern factory industries, right? We spoke about how the transportation system had evolved. We talked about how these cities in the North were growing due to immigration and urbanization. And we really focused on this new increase in trade and production happening. And so while industry was exploding in the North, the South, the South stuck to what it's always done, right? And we really start to see, or at least the South really starts to pay attention, and they see that they seriously start to fall behind, right? And so, like I said, in the North, we have these cities that are flourishing, right? They have a huge, large increase in the population due to immigration and urbanization, right? Urbanization being when people move from rural towns to these bigger cities to find jobs, right? And again, because everyone's moving to these cities to look for these jobs, we see a huge rise in the factories and mass production of textiles happening, right, with the factory system, the use of interchangeable parts, so on and so forth. And we really see here that in the North, they are responsible for 84% of the nation's manufacturing. So 84% of all factories and manufacturing companies, they lie in the North. And again, because of the market revolution, we saw this development in the transportation system as well, with the roads and canals and the trains. So we're also going to see during this time that thousands of miles of railroads are being laid, making trade much more efficient than it used to be. But lastly, in the North, we see these corporations start being formed. And now the difference between a corporation and a business is that a corporation is going to be a much bigger business, meaning that they're going to have more power, they're going to have, I guess, more factories, and eventually these corporations are going to start to get the support of the United States government. But this is all what's happening in the North. The South, again, is beginning to fall behind. So the South, they really only have a couple of large cities, right? It's still mostly sparsely populated, meaning everyone is spread out, focused on agriculture and their cash crops, right? So at this time, they're going to have 16% of the nation's manufacturing, right? So they're only going to produce about 16% of produced factory goods, right, compared to the North's 84%. So it's really not going to be that long. And because the South is mostly focused on agriculture, they're going to rely heavily on trading with the North in Europe, right? And they're really going to rely heavily on making sure that they get the North and the European goods. And so you have to sit and think, if the South during this time, due to the market revolution, is really focused on agriculture, who's really working to produce these agricultural products? Think about it. Now the answer is slaves, right? So the South, because they see this increased demand for cotton, which is their main cash crop at this time, they're really going to expand slavery at this time. Meaning, going along with the growth of the market revolution, we're going to see an increased demand for cotton. And so during this time, the Southerners are going to start referring to cotton as king cotton, right? Being that the cotton is king, that they have to follow its every demand, that their whole lives rely on making sure this king is pleased and being produced, right? And especially now with the creation of the cotton gin, it's much easier to separate the seed from the cotton. So, that's obviously keeping up with this increased demand. We're also going to see in the South a little bit of Western expansion, meaning that there are going to be some people that are trying to move westward so that they can create their own farms and their own plantations, right? Take over a little bit of more land. And we're also going to see in the South a little bit of illegal trade happening. Because remember, at this time, the importation of slaves is no longer legal, meaning that Americans can no longer trade goods for Africans that are being brought over from Africa to the United States, right? That's no longer a thing. And so the only way for Americans to expand their slavery populations is, yes, a little bit in part of due to this illegal trade, but mostly they're going to rely heavily on making sure that the population of slaves that they already have is growing. And the main way that they're going to focus on doing that is they're going to emphasize natural birth, meaning they're really going to start pushing these slaves to start to reproduce and have children, right? And they're going to expand the domestic slave trade. And so to put it into perspective on how much this population grew, is that in 1800, at the turn of the century, there was about 1 million slaves in the United States. But by 1860, that number is going to grow from 1 million to 4 million. So in a matter of 60 years, the population is going to grow by 3 million people, which is a lot. That is a huge growth of slave population. And so with these 4 million enslaved people, they're mostly going to live on large plantations. Now, because of this expansions of slavery, we need to remember that wealth in the South is measured by how much land people own and how many slaves they own also. But to some, the practice of slavery is going to be known as the peculiar institution. And that's really because some white people are going to become sensitive about the topic of slavery. They're going to recognize that slaves are, at the end of the day, human. And so they become sensitive on the topic because they've recognized how slaves are being treated. But those who are pro-slavery and do like slavery happening, the practice of slavery happening in the South, they're going to be known as the slavery apologists, right? And so, in order to have a counter argument against these white people who are sensitive to the topic of slavery, they're going to start using a lot of historical and religious arguments to support their claim as to why the South should continue slavery. They're saying that slavery is good, right? It's good for both the master and the slave. They have, it is a relationship that is dependent on each other. And so, because we see this huge growth and this topic of slavery, slaves are going to be employed doing whatever their owners demanded of them, right? At the end of the day, slavery is still a practice that is happening in the country. And so, if a slave was bought, they would be simply just doing whatever their owners wanted them to. So we really see slaves working a variety of jobs, whether they are working in the fields or they're a house slave working on the day-to-day house chores, or they're a domestic slave being a nanny or a caregiver to someone. Right? But we really see that by the end of the 1850s, 1860s, the South is going to provide 2/3 of cotton in all of the United States exports. So even though some people might disagree to slavery, we clearly do see that there has been a really big growth in not only the population of the slaves, but the production of the cotton that the slaves are working on. And now, again, since we see this rise in the slaves, we do have to talk about their treatment, right? Slaves were not in any ways treated well. They lived in terrible conditions. They were extremely poor, meaning that they had inadequate quarters, which means that their sleeping and living areas were really, really bad, poorly built, not suitable for people. They also had inadequate rations, meaning that the food that they were getting fed was not good, right? It was not nutritious, it was also not enough. Um, and so many times slaves were starving, right? And because their quarters and their foods were not that good, um, we're really going to see a rise in disease happening amongst the slaves, right? And remember, at the end of the day, to their owners, slaves are just another tool for them to be used. And if they got sick or they died, they were very much easily replaceable. But with these conditions, again, we see that there's this huge emphasis in these slaves reproducing, right? And when you think about it, all of these equal a terrible living condition, right, for a regular adult human. And since we see this emphasis on reproduction, we see all of these kids being born at the time, being born into these terrible living conditions. So we're also going to see a really high child mortality rate. And that's going to be about 66%, meaning that 66% of children that are born are also going to die. And if you thought that was bad, well, the slaves, they had to deal with even worse treatment, right? On top of dealing with all of these four things, the slaves were also um, they were also subject to punishment, right? So if they acted out in any way that was negative or their owner did not like, they could be punished, right? So within the United States as a whole, these states had already created the slave codes, which was the state of rules that stated what a slave could and could not do. For example, one of the slave codes was that slaves could not have any type of assembly without a white person present, meaning no type of church service or maybe a wedding service or even like a gathering to celebrate someone's birthday. That was not allowed. But we also see that there were other forms of punishment, right? The ones that we typically know, right? There was whipping and beating, the slaves were in chains and irons, and even going as far as branding, which is when they mark these slaves in some type of symbol that notifies everyone else that they belong to that specific farm, right? Like how we often see in cattle and animals, like horses and cows and sheep. And slaves, they would even be punishment because of the incompetence of their overseers and their drivers. Now, what this really means is that an overseer is going to be a white person who oversees the slaves, right? They're going to be kind of like the leader, giving the slaves their day-to-day tasks. A driver, on the other hand, is going to be very similar to an overseer, but the big difference is that it's not going to be a white person. A driver is going to be an enslaved person, a slave, who was promoted by their owner to give the slaves their day-to-day task. But if those two people, the overseer or the driver, weren't competent and not good at leading and doing their job, then their team would be subject to punishment. And so, as a reaction and as a result to these terrible conditions that these slaves had to live through, we did see a number of them run away, right? It was very few, but we did see a number of them run away, try to gain their freedom. But we also saw a rise in some revolts. And now, there was also very few revolts. It wasn't often that happened. It was a very bold move. But we do know that one of the biggest revolts to happen at this time was in 1831, which was the Nat Turner Revolt. Now, the Nat Turner Revolt, this was really big, right? Because Nat Turner in their revolt ended up killing about 55 white people, which was, when you think about it, was really good at the time for them, right? And this revolt is really going to give hope to enslaved African Americans, right? News of this revolt is going to go spread to the other plantations and spread to the other enslaved African Americans, and it's going to give them hope, because even though this revolt wasn't successful, it is going to give hope that maybe one day or someday enough enslaved African Americans will revolt that it will gain them their freedom. But the southern states, they're really going to hate this flare of hope. And that's going to drive them to tighten their slave codes and make them more strict. So, with this expansion of slavery, it's really going to have a cultural impact in the United States. So much so that we're even going to see a rise in the anti slavery movement, right? Being against slavery. And this is mostly in part due to the Second Great Awakening, right? Remember that the Great Awakening is this movement of people who have found a refound love for their religion, right? And so, with that, the Second Great Awakening is going to lead many Christians to start viewing slavery as a sin, right? And they're going to start being against slavery. Now, this does not mean that they all of a sudden like African Americans, right? That they're still very much racist, but again, they're going to recognize that at the end of the day, they're still people, and it is against the Christian values to enslave others, right? So, with this new anti-slavery movement, they came to the solution that they needed to end slavery. But not just end slavery, their solution was to end slavery and return the slaves back to Africa. And the reasoning behind this is that they're saying that this was going to end slavery, but it was not going to end racism, right? Remember, these white people still did not like these African Americans, right? And many Northerners who supported this anti-slavery movement, again, were still very much against slavery. They understood that these were humans and slavery was a horrific, brutal thing that they were being subjected to, but they were still racist, right? They were still very much racist and did not like them. And this movement is going to be supported by a lot of really prominent Americans, right? And just to name a few, some that are going to support this are going to be President James Madison and James Monroe, the Chief Justice John Marshall, and even someone we haven't talked about before, but we've heard of and we know what he's done. This movement's going to be supported by Abraham Lincoln. And so what they end up doing is that the Americans are going to buy a piece of land off the coast of Africa, which is known as Liberia. And they're going to try to start sending these African slaves back to Africa. But remember, there's 4 million slaves in the United States at this time. So logically, it would be impossible to return every African slave back to Africa. So this anti-slavery movement is at the end not going to work. But it is going to lead to a rise in the abolition movement. Now, abolition we've talked about in the past before. If you don't remember, abolition is simply calling for the immediate and complete freeing of all slaves. Now, it does not mean that they just want to send them back to Africa. This is just saying we need to free all slaves in the United States now. And during this time, we're going to see a lot of famous abolitionists, right? One of which is going to be a man named William Lloyd Garrison. And what William Lloyd Garrison does is that he's going to publish a newspaper called The Liberator. And he's going to start publishing all of these abolitionist beliefs, right? And going to spread those all over the country, right? And he's even going to start some protests at the time. And he goes as far as burning a copy of the Constitution in protest of slavery, right? And again, he began that publication and has this abolitionist paper that's spread all over the country. Another famous abolitionist is going to be a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe, which is this woman we see here on the screen. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she is an author, right? And she writes what's known as Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin, when you look at it, it kind of sounds like a teenage type book. However, when you read it, it depicts the harsh conditions that were experienced by enslaved African Americans, right? So when people picked up to read this book, they expected a cute little story, but they started reading it and they realized that, oh, this wasn't a cute little story. This is actually the harsh reality that the African Americans had to deal with. But arguably one of the biggest or most famous abolitionist at this time is going to be a man that you see here in the corner. And that man, his name is Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass, he is going to become a really big abolitionist. Um, He's going to be very widely known. Even to this day, he is widely known. And what he does is that he has the unique experience of being able to speak about the brutality and degradation of slavery from a first-hand experience. So Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave, right? And he was able to publish many works and public speak a lot about his experience as a slave and what he had to deal with, really showing the harsh conditions that slaves are subjected to. Of course, these are not the only abolitionists. There's a whole lot that we know, like Harriet Tubman, that we have not spoken about. But these are going to be really monumental to the abolition movement. And so the Americans, they're going to have a mixed reaction to abolition. And so, as a reaction to the abolitionist movement, and like everything else we've talked about in class, we need to talk about how the North reacts versus the South reacts. So, in the North, there's going to be a lot of mixed emotions, right? We're going to see about half of the people that are still going to be very much against slavery, and those are going to be for slavery, right? Those that are for slavery, they're going to recognize that the North and the South, they rely on each other. Remember that in order for the North to function, they're going to need the cotton from the South that they get from the South. And the North is also, it loaned money to the South. And so they recognize that if they got rid of slavery, the production of cotton is going to slow down, meaning that the South is going to make less money, which is going to take them even longer to pay back the North the money that they were loaned. But also, since the cotton production will slow down, then the textile manufacturing of the textile manufacturing that is needed um, is also going to slow down. And again, even though many were against slavery, they were still racist. And they feared that if they had freed all of the slaves, that all of these African Americans are now going to start to flood the northern cities and try to take whatever jobs were available, right? So um, some that were in the north were very much scared of that happening, and they also feared that it would lead to war, right? Seeing that the southern farmers, they owed a lot of money to the northern banks, and if that money wasn't paid, well, then the north would get really angry at that, and which would lead to war. However, in the south, their reactions to abolition is going to be very different than the North. Instead of it being mixed reactions, it was very unanimous. We can see that in the South, they're going to start to argue that slavery was an absolute necessity for the South, right? They're going to defend slavery with all their heart, right? They're going to start making arguments saying that slaves did not want their freedom, right? They're going to start saying that the slaves and the slaveholders are going to get along, right? They have a very positive relationship with each other and they depend on each other. But honestly, in reality, that was not true. Their biggest argument was going to be that slaves are necessary for their economy to run and that African Americans, these black people, they were inferior to the white people, right? The white Americans. And so Southerners, we're going to see some tension start to rise even more with the North and the South, right? So much so because the Southerners are going to become irritated that the Yankees, the North, are trying to dictate their way of life, right? They're going to get irritated at those Northerners that are calling for abolition, the abolition of slavery. They're going to get irritated at them by saying, hey, get out of my business. This has nothing to do with you. We're still giving you the cotton that you need, so let us do what we need to do. So the topic of slavery is going to become essentially controversial in the United States, right? It's going to be this heavily discussed topic that many people are going to have many different opinions in. And so what you guys are going to do today is you guys are going to investigate exactly why slavery was such a divisive issue, right? So right now, what I want you to do, it's going to look slightly different for you guys since I'm not going to be here in class. With a group, I want you to pretend to be different members of the American society and how that group of people responded to the issue of slavery. And so instead of me assigning you one of the following, you will get to pick to pretend one of the following groups and you're going to pretend to get in their mindset. So you can either be in the mindset of the free African Americans at the time, the Southern whites at the time, the moderate abolitionists, the Northern industrialists, meaning the Northern workers, and the radical abolitionists. Right? So these are your 5 options, and if you don't understand what any of them are, let me know. What I need you guys to do is once you get in your groups of 3 to 4 people, you need to, again, pretend to be one of the following groups. And once you do, you will need to be able to defend this question, right? You need to figure out what should the United States do about slavery. And so for your assignment today that you will turn in is that you will need a sheet of paper and you will answer the following 3 questions. Pretending to be one of these members of society, you will need to write an initial statement that outlines the position of your group, meaning you're answering the question, what should the United States do about slavery? The second thing you need to do on your sheet of paper is you need to list the reasons why your solution is the best possible solution, right? Writing your because, right? Here you say, this is the best solution because, and then list that out. The last thing you need to write on this sheet of paper is going to be reasons why other groups do not have the best solution, and you need to refer to at least 2 other groups. So for example, if you decide to pretend to be the Southern whites, your statement will have to say, we should keep slavery and do this with it. This is because, fill in the blank, and then you say, one reason why the solution of the radical abolitionist is not the best solution is because, and then you would also say the same for, say, for example, the free African Americans, right? And then list the reason why their solution might not be the best. Now, make sure that you write this on a sheet of paper. If you are working in a group, make sure that everyone that's in your group, their name is on it as well. And make sure you write on this sheet of paper what group of American society you are pretending to be. And of course, if you have any questions, let me know. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and I will see you next time. Bye.